How much is this?
I don't think this would fit you.
Well, I didn't ask if it would fit. I asked how much it was.
How much is this, Marie?
It's very expensive.
It's very expensive.
Let's talk about a movie that had absolutely no business becoming one of the most beloved romantic comedies ever made. Think about what Pretty Woman actually is on paper. A billionaire corporate raider hires a Hollywood Boulevard sex worker to act as his companion for a week. His lawyer turns predatory. Nobody behaves particularly well. The power imbalance is enormous. And yet, somehow, the whole thing ends with Roy Orbison playing over a fire escape rescue and an audience weeping happy tears into their popcorn. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens through a combination of extraordinary luck, a complete reinvention of the original material, studio interference that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to the project, and two lead performances that clicked in ways nobody fully predicted. Pretty Woman landed in theaters on March 23, 1990. It cost roughly $14 million to make. It earned over $460 million worldwide. It turned Julia Roberts into one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, revived Richard Gere's career at a moment when he was genuinely questioning whether he still had one, and permanently rewired how an entire generation thinks about rodeo drive, opera nights, and the correct way to respond to a condescending salesperson. But the version of the movie that exists, the fairy tale, the fantasy, the one you've probably rewatched more times than you'd care to admit, almost didn't happen. The road from the original screenplay to the final cut is one of the stranger transformation stories in Hollywood history, full of replaced endings, rejected casting choices, improvised moments that became iconic, and a Disney executive who looked at a gritty drama about prostitution in Los Angeles and thought, what if we made this a Cinderella story? Here are 15 weird facts about Pretty Woman that changed the way you see the whole film. Before there was a shopping montage, before there was a red dress, before there was a billionaire on a fire escape holding roses, there was a screenplay called 3000. That title wasn't romantic. It was transactional. $3,000, the amount Edward Lewis pays Vivian Ward for a week of her time. And in J.F. Lawton's original script, that number carried the full weight of what the arrangement actually was. No fairy tale gloss. No sparkling eyes and infectious laugh, softening the edges. Just a harsh, uncomfortable look at what desperation and wealth do to people when they collide on a Hollywood street corner. In the original version of the story, Vivian was not the warm, funny, emotionally magnetic woman Julia Roberts eventually brought to the screen. She was written as a drug addict, volatile, damaged, trapped in a life the script showed no interest in romanticizing. Edward wasn't a brooding prince waiting to have his frozen heart thawed. He was cold, detached, and at points genuinely cruel. The dynamic between them wasn't chemistry building toward love. It was transaction grinding toward an ugly conclusion. The ending of 3000 reflected all of that. Edward doesn't return in a limousine. He doesn't climb a fire escape. He pulls his car into a side street, argues with Vivian, shoves her out of the vehicle, throws the cash on top of her, and drives away. Some drafts reportedly went even further into darkness. One version apparently included Vivian dying of a drug overdose, which is a sentence that becomes almost surreal once you picture it against the film's actual final act. 3000 was a legitimate piece of social realism. It was making a point. It just wasn't something you'd build a date night around. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was running Disney at the time, looked at the 3000 screenplay and saw something the original writer may not have fully intended, the skeleton of a modern fairy tale. Strip away the drugs, pull back the cruelty, sand down the ugliest edges, add humor, add warmth, make Edward redeemable rather than irredeemable. And suddenly you don't have a cautionary tale about exploitation. You have Cinderella in a penthouse with a sports car instead of a pumpkin carriage and a negotiated rate instead of a glass slipper. Katzenberg reportedly championed this reimagining aggressively. The script went through approximately 6 rewrites. Each pass pulled it further away from the grim social commentary of 3000 and closer to the glossy, warm, swooning experience that audiences eventually fell in love with. The drugs disappeared from Vivian's character. Edward's coldness was reframed as emotional unavailability rather than active malice, something a charming enough woman could theoretically crack open. The ending got rebuilt entirely. Gary Marshall came on board to direct with a clear mandate. Make this feel like a fairy tale. He was the right person for it. Marshall had spent his career, from Happy Days to Laverne and Shirley to the Flamingo Kid, finding the warmth inside stories that could easily have turned cynical. He understood crowd-pleasing instinctively. Julia Roberts, who eventually starred in the film, later described the original 3000 script as a really dark and depressing, horrible, terrible story about two horrible people. She admitted that when she heard Disney had acquired it, her first thought was that they must be planning to animate it. Instead, they handed it to Gary Marshall, and Gary Marshall handed it to Julia Roberts. And the rest is, in every sense of the phrase, history. The role that made Julia Roberts a superstar didn't exactly arrive at her door with the red carpet rolled out. When the script was still in its darker iteration, closer to 3000 than to the eventual romantic comedy, the character Vivian required a different kind of actress entirely. The early casting conversations gravitated toward performers who could carry the weight of a tragedy. Someone who could make an audience believe in a woman being ground down by a brutal system, rather than someone who could make you laugh out loud in one scene and break your heart in the next. Molly Ringwald was approached and passed. Michelle Pfeiffer was considered and declined. Meg Ryan, who was herself in the process of becoming the defining romantic comedy actress of the era, also passed. Daryl Hannah turned the role down with considerably more conviction than the others. She reportedly called the script misogynistic and demeaning to women, which, when you're talking about the 3000 version of the material, was not an unfair characterization. By the time the script had been substantially reworked, jokes added, ending rebuilt, Edward made softer, the whole thing tilted toward romance. The requirements changed completely. They no longer needed someone to embody a tragedy in progress. They needed someone audiences would genuinely enjoy spending 2 hours with, funny, surprising, emotionally open, capable of being ridiculous and vulnerable within the same scene. Roberts was 22 years old when she got the role. She had appeared in Mystic Pizza and Steel Magnolias. The latter had earned her an Academy Award nomination, but she wasn't yet a movie star in the full sense of the phrase. She was a very talented young actress with a rising profile. Pretty Woman turned her into something categorically different. The combination of Roberts's natural instincts and the rewritten script proved to be the specific alchemy the project needed. Vivian shifted to fit her. The dialogue loosened up, the physicality became bigger, the emotional range expanded. The character became, essentially, a Julia Roberts character, and the movie became, essentially, a Julia Roberts movie. Richard Gere's career was in a genuinely uncertain place when Pretty Woman came to him. The early and mid-1980s had produced some significant work for Gere. An Officer and a Gentleman in 1982 had been a massive commercial success. But the late 1980s had been less kind. Projects weren't landing the way they once had. The roles being offered weren't firing his imagination. The question of whether he wanted to continue acting at all was, by his own account, something he was actively wrestling with. When the Pretty Woman script arrived, his initial read wasn't enthusiastic. A rich man who hires a companion for a week, on paper. It seemed like a fairly thin premise for a character. What changed his mind was Edward's interior life, specifically the particular quality of a man so emotionally locked down that he has essentially no access to his own feelings, and watching that armor crack because someone refuses to play by his rules. Gary Marshall worked with Gere extensively on developing that interiority. Edward needed to register as a complete human being, not just a handsome man in expensive suits who serves as a plot device for Vivian's transformation. The character had to have his own journey. Gere invested in that, and it shows in the performance. Edward's discomfort with intimacy, his surprise at his own reactions to Vivian, his slow and somewhat bewildered arrival at genuine emotion. These are carefully constructed and carefully played. Watching Roberts work also convinced him to commit. The chemistry between them was evident early, and Gere recognized that he was being offered something genuinely interesting. A scene partner who was going to bring something unpredictable and alive to every take. Pretty Woman became one of the defining performances of his career. From the edge of walking away from the profession, he landed back at the top of the romantic lead list. Not a bad outcome for a project he almost passed on while mentally packing up his dressing room. The shopping humiliation sequence, where Vivian walks into boutiques in her working clothes and gets quietly, and then not so quietly escorted out, works so well partly because there's a foundation of actual snobbery underneath it. When the production sought permission to film in real Rodeo Drive boutiques, a number of high-end stores declined. Their concern was straightforward. They did not want to be associated with a film whose protagonist was a sex worker, even one being reframed as a romantic heroine. The image these boutiques cultivated was precisely the image of exclusivity that the film was trying to interrogate, and they had no interest in lending their actual premises to that interrogation. So the filmmakers did what filmmakers do. They found stores that would cooperate, and they leaned into the attitude that was already ambient on the street. The barely concealed contempt of sales clerks directed Vivian didn't require much invention. The material was there. It just needed to be pointed at a camera. The irony of what followed is almost too neat to be true. The film came out. It became a phenomenon. And suddenly those same boutiques, or boutiques very like them, found themselves the destination for tourists doing the Pretty Woman pilgrimage. People wanted to stand where Vivian got snubbed. They wanted to stroll the same sidewalk. They wanted to deliver the line. The stores that had refused to associate themselves with a movie about a sex worker ended up being the backdrop for one of the most enduring pop culture rituals of the 1990s and beyond. What is now the climax of Pretty Woman? Edward in a limousine, white flowers in hand, overcoming his debilitating fear of heights to climb a fire escape because he has finally realized what Vivian means to him, did not exist in the original cut of the film. The movie initially ended far more simply, and far less satisfyingly. Edward pays Vivian for the week as agreed. They say goodbye. The transaction concludes. Roll credits. The early version honored the realistic mechanics of what their arrangement actually was, which meant it provided the emotional payoff of a firm handshake. Test audiences were, to put it diplomatically, not pleased. The feedback was consistent and pointed. 2 hours of watching these characters dismantle each other's defenses, only to have the movie simply stop without delivering any emotional resolution, felt like a betrayal. Audiences had been invited to invest in a romance, and the ending refused to acknowledge that romance had occurred. The response cards essentially read as a collective. Why did you do this to us? The studio acted quickly. The cast was recalled. A fire escape was constructed. Gere Marshall, who by this point was fully committed to the fairy tale register the film had drifted into, orchestrated a new ending that gave audiences exactly what they'd been building toward for 90 minutes. The She Rescues Him Right Back exchange became the emotional thesis statement of the entire film. Marshall later acknowledged that the original ending had simply stopped matching the movie they'd actually made. Somewhere during production, Pretty Woman had become something different from what the screenplay described. Warmer, funnier, more romantic, and the ending needed to catch up. The test screening disaster was the forcing function that made that happen. Without those unhappy test audiences, Pretty Woman ends on a shrug. With them, it ends on one of the most replayed final sequences in the genre. The scene is set up as a standard romantic gesture. Edward presents Vivian with a diamond necklace before their opera evening. The necklace is spectacular. The moment is meant to be sophisticated and tender. It proceeds accordingly right up until Richard Gere decides to improvise. As Roberts leans in to look at the necklace, Gere snaps the jewelry box shut on her fingers. Her reaction? A startled yelp that collapses immediately into that completely unfiltered, full-body laugh. Was not planned, not rehearsed, and not in any version of the script. It was pure, unguarded Julia Roberts responding to being ambushed on camera by her co-star. Gere Marshall watched the playback and understood immediately that he was never going to get anything better than that moment. No amount of preparation or precise execution was going to produce a reaction that real, that spontaneous, that specifically Roberts. The planned, polished version of the scene was abandoned. The prank take went into the film and into every trailer and promotional clip for the next 3 decades. It's a perfect illustration of something Marshall understood intuitively as a director. Sometimes the best thing a performance can be is honest. Vivian's laugh in that scene isn't a character choice. It's a human being genuinely caught off guard and genuinely finding something funny. Audiences can feel the difference, even when they can't articulate it. The jewelry box moment is in Pretty Woman's highlight reel precisely because it's the moment the movie stops being a movie for 2 seconds and becomes something that just happened. The choice to take Vivian to the opera for their public debut together wasn't arbitrary, and it wasn't simply a matter of what was convenient or visually impressive, though it is certainly both of those things. The opera selected for that sequence was chosen because its plot echoes the central dynamic of Pretty Woman itself. A woman from a different world is swept into a life she was never supposed to inhabit, and her authentic emotional response to that experience is the most real thing in the room. Vivian watches the performance and responds the way a real person would, not with the polished, restrained appreciation of someone performing sophistication, but with genuine, overwhelming feeling. She cries. She doesn't try to stop herself. She's not performing culture appreciation for Edward's benefit. She's just being moved by something beautiful and not having the social conditioning to pretend otherwise. Edward, meanwhile, watches her instead of the stage. It's a quiet directorial choice that does significant work. We're past the midpoint of the film. He's already fascinated by her. But this scene is the moment where he sees her seeing something and recognizes that her capacity for feeling, unguarded, unperformed, unashamed, is exactly what he lacks and what he wants. The red dress is the image from Pretty Woman. It's on the poster. It's the Halloween costume. It's the shorthand for the entire movie when anyone needs to reference the entire movie in a single visual. It almost wasn't red. Early costume discussions explored other directions. Softer, more muted tones that might have made Vivian seem gentler, more easily integrated into Edward's world, less startling in formal settings. Colors that would have read as sweet rather than commanding. Choices that, in a different film or with a different lead actress, might have served the character perfectly well. But Pretty Woman had, by the time costumes were being finalized, become a specific kind of film, one that required Vivian's transformation to register as a coronation rather than a quiet upgrade. When she walks out in the dress for the opera evening, the moment needs to land. The audience at home, like the people in Edward's social orbit, needs to recalibrate. This is the same woman from the opening scenes, but now the outside has caught up with the presence she's had all along. Deep, saturated red accomplished that. Anything softer would have let her blend. The red makes her arrive. The costume decision, seemingly cosmetic, is actually a storytelling decision. The dress is doing thematic work. It announces that Vivian is not trying to disappear into Edward's world. She's entering it on her own terms, at full volume. The color was the right call, and the film's entire visual legacy proves it. Barney Thompson, the Regent Beverly Wilshire's hotel manager, could very easily have been a different character entirely. The polite but firm obstacle, the man whose job it is to maintain standards and whose presence in the story is primarily to represent the world that views Vivian as an intrusion. He became something much more interesting. Essentially Vivian's fairy godfather, the insider who decides she deserves a chance and quietly makes sure she gets one. The reason Barney became that character is partly Gary Marshall's instinct and partly the result of a friendship that began on a basketball court in 1979, when Hector Elizondo accidentally hit Marshall in the face with a badly thrown pass. Marshall's response was reportedly to tell Elizondo that he might be a terrible basketball player, but he was a terrific actor, and that he had a project for him. That was the beginning of a collaboration that lasted Marshall's entire directorial career. Elizondo appeared in all 18 films Marshall directed, every single one, from Young Doctors in Love in 1982 to Mother's Day in 2016. Marshall knew what Elizondo brought to a role, and he shaped Barney specifically around those qualities: steadiness, warmth, quiet authority, the particular gift of treating everyone with the same fundamental dignity regardless of what they're wearing or where they came from. In a film populated by people who assess Vivian at a glance and find her wanting, Barney is the rare character who looks again. He coaches her on etiquette without condescension. He manages the staff around her without making her feel like a problem to be managed. He opens doors that the rest of the world would keep firmly shut. The film works better because he's in it, and he's in it because Gary Marshall once caught a basketball with his face. If you already find Philip Stuckey deeply unpleasant, and the film is carefully constructed to make sure you do, it's worth knowing that what's on screen is the restrained version. In the darker early drafts of the material, Stuckey was written with considerably less restraint. His predatory behavior toward Vivian was more extreme. His willingness to weaponize his position was less disguised. The character pushed the whole story toward a register that felt less like a villain in a romantic comedy and more like a genuine threat in a very different kind of film. As the script evolved toward its fairy tale destination, Stuckey needed to evolve with it. The most extreme elements were pulled back, not because the filmmakers wanted to excuse his behavior, but because the film needed him to function as a villain you cheer against rather than a horror that overwhelms the genre. A romantic comedy can accommodate a repellent antagonist. It can't accommodate one who makes the audience feel unsafe watching. What Jason Alexander does with the calibrated version of the character is precisely right. Stuckey is performatively charming in professional settings and nakedly vicious the moment he thinks no one important is watching. He represents the version of Edward that Edward might become, someone who has learned to treat people as assets and liabilities rather than human beings. When Edward finally punches him, it registers as the moment Edward officially chooses a different way of being in the world. Alexander plays the transition from slick to threatening without telegraphing it, which makes the hotel room scene genuinely uncomfortable in a way that still works within the film's overall register. The movie needed exactly that, and he delivered it. Oh, Pretty Woman was already a classic by 1990. Roy Orbison had recorded it in 1964. It had been a #1 hit. It had aged into the kind of song that everybody recognized and nobody needed to rediscover. And then the film used it, and the song got handed a comeback it never needed but absolutely accepted. The original lyrics are about a man watching a woman walk past him on the street, hoping she'll turn around and give him a chance. It's a song about wanting, specifically, about watching from a distance and hoping. The perspective belongs entirely to the observer. What the film does with that song is quietly radical. The opening sequence places it under footage of Vivian moving through Hollywood on her own terms, not being observed, but occupying space. A song about a man watching a woman walk by becomes, through context and editing, a song about a woman moving through the world on her own authority. The wanting becomes becoming. The observer's fantasy becomes the subject's reality. Slapping the film's title directly onto that track locked them together permanently in the cultural imagination. The guitar riff now conjures the film as automatically as it conjures the song. You hear those opening notes, and you're not primarily thinking about 1964. You're thinking about boots and a wig, and a particular version of Hollywood that only exists in this movie. Kit DeLuca exists in Pretty Woman for what amounts to a small fraction of the film's total running time. She appears in the opening sequences. She surfaces at a few key moments. She delivers the coda after Vivian's fairy tale resolves. Add it all up, and you have maybe 15 minutes of actual screen time. And yet Kit is one of the characters people most reliably remember, most reliably quote, and most reliably bring up when discussing the film. That is entirely Laura San Giacomo's achievement. The character as written could have been purely functional. The friend who establishes context, provides some comic relief, and exists so that Vivian has someone to compare herself against. The psychic role, the one who makes the protagonist look more respectable by comparison. You have seen that character in approximately 100 films, and you do not remember her name in any of them.